So I think for me, my Indigenous background has definitely helped me identify with students, Indigenous students, Native American students, Mexican American, Hispanic. And I think also through my personal experience, it allows me to connect with them on a personal level. Whereas if I didn't identify as Indigenous, maybe that connection wouldn't be as strong. And so I think that it's offered me that advantage to connect with students and then colleagues as well, and build and support those positive relationships that I think are very much needed for students.
I wish my Indigenous identity would have impacted my education. So I'm Kanaka Maoli, which is another way of saying Native Hawaiian. And growing up in the school system that I grew up in, there was virtually no discussion about Hawaiian identity other than statehood and Hawaii becoming the 50th state. I think it would have impacted my education greatly if I had had some education about what it meant to be a Hawaiian people and the history of the Hawaiian Islands. So not receiving that education until my adulthood, the impact I would have liked to have had it had would have been to have a sense of pride in my history, my culture, my background, which I have to search for myself. I've been torn about this over the years because growing up, I could make excuses, and I would allow the excuses that my instructors would give, that, you know, there's a lot to cover in the curriculum and we can't always cover all of the cultures we'd like to cover. And I grew up with that and I accepted that for a while, but watching my son and my daughter not know about their history and their culture has been, in some cases, a real sore point for them. And they're both young adults, 19 and 22 right now. And I think what's been sad for me is that unless I expose them to family or expose them to food, unfortunately, or some of the larger festivals, they don't have that self-esteem as what it means to be a Hawaiian. And so what that has meant is that in their experience, and then also in my experience growing up, is what it means to be Hawaiian gets told to me by other people, usually through the lens of tourism, through the lens of the Discovery Channel, but not necessarily through our own lens or my voice. So I would have liked to have been raised with that self-confidence, or at least that self-pride that a lot of people who have their studies, who have their histories incorporated in their academic course load or in their studies, have, in a way that I just had to wait until my adulthood in order to acquire that information, a sense of self-respect and self-love for myself.
How has my Indigenous background affected my education? Well, first of all, when I was growing up, my Indigenous background was taken away from us, in a sense, because I'm Mexican, half Spanish and half Indigenous, Tepehuanes Indian from Mexico. And living in the United States, if you weren't one of one of the tribes from the 50 states, you weren't considered to be Native American or Indian. And so even though I could identify with Native Americans that were in my classrooms or in the classes that I went to, I wasn't allowed to be one of them or to bond with them. But that doesn't stop children from bonding. And I went to school at a time when the Native Americans children were they were going to school, and they were living in the boarding schools, and they were going to school with us. And I knew that they were different, and they were different because they were quiet. And the horrors of what they must have been going to was something that impacted me tremendously, because I used to go home when I first started off at a Catholic school, when I went to public schools, when I found this, and I used to go home and I used to think about how horrible it would be to be separated from my parents from when school started until Christmas, when they were allowed to go home. And it used to bother me. And so I used to go out of my way to develop friendships with them, or to try to be a friend. But they didn't have a lot of trust for us. But I did make some lifelong friends through those through my early years, and those are relationships that I value still today. In terms of my education, they did teach us. I went to a school in New Mexico, and they did teach us about Native Americans, and we learned through that, even through college. That was something but it was always told through the lens of a sociologist or an anthropologist, again, not the lens of the people who were living it or experiencing it. When I was in high school, I saw the American Indian movement take effect, and I was so proud of what the Native Americans were doing. And then again, I saw that in Gallup, New Mexico, where I was raised, all Native Americans and on the reservation were being taught by people from the Midwest and white people from the Midwest. And around that time, they started to fight back, and they started to say, we want our children educated, we want our children to come back, and we want our children to teach, or our people to come back and to teach us. And they started demanding that their people start teaching the children. And I think that that's made a big impact in maintaining and keeping the language and the culture alive in what's happening, especially in Arizona and New Mexico. I wish that had happened to me. My family is from from Durango, Mexico. And so we're Tepehuanes Indians. And the Tepehuanes Indians have been integrated into the Hispanic culture. Part of it is because of the caste system. In Mexico, you know, they still have a caste system. The Spanish are at the top and the Native Americans that are at the bottom. And then in between, of course, are the Mexicans, are what are called the mixed breed, half breed. And that's what I am as a Mexican American, is someone who's half white or European, Spanish, and then also Indigenous. And there is still a lot of discrimination against Indigenous people, not only here in the United States, but also in Mexico. So how has it affected my education? Whenever I see or I'm around Native Americans, my heart goes out to them, and I want to help them, and I want to make them feel as warm and as comfortable as they can be, as I can, so that they can have an experience here at our college that makes them know that they're valued and that someone cares for them.
As far as education, I think for me, it's been a lot of questions that needed to be answered because of what's been told throughout the years, and you learn things through the school system, you learn things through a story told by a person that does not identify with being Indigenous, does not identify with any, anything that has anything to do with your family history, the dynamic, just everything that has anything to do with the Indigenous people. And so for me, I think the hardest part is, for a long time, I didn't know, and I didn't have anybody to sit me down and educate me on these things. And so when you hear it through the school system, you have a lot of questions. You want to ask the questions, but when you do ask those questions aren't getting answered. They're only getting answered from their perspective. And so for me, after wondering and trying to understand where I came from personally, because I didn't know, and when I would sit down with elders in my family, they didn't know either, it really hurt me because I have no idea how to identify with whatever group I belong to, or it could be a couple groups that I belong to. And so finding out recently that I do have Indigenous blood really hit home for me. And so as far as education, I wanted to learn more about the Indigenous because there's a lot to be learned, there's a lot to understand. And working with Indigenous students, I want to be able to share information, and I want to be able to educate them on things that maybe I didn't know or have not known. And so they can pass those things on, because we're honestly limited when it comes to that sense of education. We're very limited because a lot of books have been thrown away, a lot of stories, a lot of truths are not being shared, and they haven't been passed on. So it's really hard to uncover things that we would like to know. And it's hard to uncover things that has been, told to us, and we can't really dissect those things unless we really come together and learn from one another. And really, it's just tough. It's just one of those things that is a hard subject to even really discuss, especially when you find out you have a small percentage of that background. But education wise, I like to converse with people that are from that Indigenous background because I can become more educated on Indigenous backgrounds as well. So for me, it definitely was a lack thereof, but now I'm really wanting to take the steps forward to know and understand more about the Indigenous people.
There's some positive and negative impact in my education. I guess growing up, I lived in two different worlds. There's the modern world, there's the Navajo tradition that we follow. And growing up, you know, I was bullied in school. I was called an apple because my skin was red. Inside, I was considered white. And it really hurt personally of how that, you know, my high school, my middle school peers treated me that way. But like growing up, I wanted to, you know, to pursue more into my culture, even though I lived in the city for so many years. And to this day, like I still speak my language, I still carry the tradition, I wear my traditional outfit. And with this, you know, showing this identity to students, our faculty, our staff, to recognize that we're still here. We're here to pursue our higher education. Even for myself, I'm currently still working on my master's degree, working on my master's of education and educational leadership, and then working on the second master's and master's of engineering and statistical reliability and quality engineering. And I show proof by, you know, going to school every day, perfect attendance. I can show you a list of perfect attendance of certificates. And I just want to show proof that as us Indigenous people, we can make it. We can show us in these professions, either in teachers, doctors, lawyers. That's what my grandfather has always told us before he passed. He encouraged each of his grandchild that we're in that world that we need to, you know, evolve into the modern world, yet we still have to carry our tradition, carry the language, carry our, you know, our ceremonies, our teaching to pass on to the next generation. And I'm part of that generation to, you know, to carry that to our Indigenous students here on our campus. And working here at the college, you know, I'm so happy to, you know, see some students, Native students, to connect with them and connect with their parents to let them know that this is an opportunity for them to start their college career, because I've been through an experience when I was 15 years old, starting at college, Phoenix College. And with the programs that we offer, for example, Hoop of Learning, that was the program that I was first introduced at a community college. And my perception was like, am I going to do it? Am I smart enough? Am I going to have the motivation to continue if I can do this? And my father and my mother, they never went through college. They didn't know the steps. They didn't know what FAFSA was. They didn't know how to even apply for scholarships. I had to learn it myself. And then I had to get connections with my instructor through counseling, and then also advisor, Native American advisor, to, you know, make that approach to where I'm at today, to get funding and also be debt free, I guess. But part of that, you know, as you know, it really impacted really so much for me today that, you know, I can still do it. I can still pursue so much in a workplace and education, and also to be a role model to our students, and also to be a role model for our community. And I know I'm far from home, but, you know, we do have some Native American students that could see us and show that we're still here. We can still make this approach and to make a positive impact in our education.
How has my Indigenous identity impacted my education? Similar to what has already been said, for me, I always thought of myself as bicultural. My father is Mexican American and my mother is full-blooded Native American, and all of our relatives live on 2 separate reservations in Arizona. And so I always had that model of the traditional way in the Pima traditional way and the Hopi traditional way. And every summer and every holiday, I would visit those 2 different reservations. And so it was an unconscious contradiction. I was learning one thing in school, in public school, and then I would go and visit my relatives on the reservation. And it was never said by my relatives, don't believe what's taught to you. They just modeled it. And that's how I learned the traditional way. I would hear the language my elders spoke. And so I was always surrounded by the culture, the traditional culture. But then when I would come home back to Phoenix, Thanksgiving was celebrated, Indians and pilgrims. And I think at one point when I was younger, maybe in kindergarten or 1st grade, we made like little head wraps to symbolize the pilgrims and Indians. And maybe I think we put on a play. And now as an adult, through education, through self-awareness and self-exploration for myself, I realized that was inaccurate. But at the time, I knew nothing else. And I think about that. And now as an educator, but also a mother, it's important to me that I teach my children who they are. And when I connect with students, I can understand some of their lived experiences. And I think my Indigenous background has not only impacted my personal education, but in the education field in which I work and serve students.
This type of education that wasn't part of our formal education, but could have been and should have been, has a benefit to white students too. That this information isn't just so that we can build our own capacity or our self-confidence or self-esteem, but when we've got educators who are presenting Christopher Columbus as a national hero, and we have people who are resisting that being called conspiracy theorists or people who are promoting critical race theory for just wanting to teach history. You know, we're doing a disservice to our white students as well by not teaching them the broader history of Indigenous people, and that there is other sides to the story. I find it fascinating that in particular, when Indigenous people are incorporated into history books or history texts, the white people are almost always the heroes in these stories, you know, about taking a civilization that wouldn't have been able to achieve a certain degree of technical competence without the help of Western assistance. And so being able to dismantle some of these just constructs of what it means to be American, you know, and then also what it means to be successful in this country and centering that a lot to include the voices of Indigenous folks, I think is something that benefits not just us, but certainly our white counterparts as well.
Having graduated from PVCC and transferred to university, it's provided me a lot of perspective into a lot of the things that I'm learning since I'm going into the field of education as an educator, wanting to teach 5th grade. It's provided me with a lot of things to consider for Indigenous students in my future classroom, as well as myself as a learner, as a student myself at the university, and sharing those perspectives with my peers and ensuring that I'm not the only one learning these things, incorporating strategies to have a more inclusive classroom environment and inclusive teaching practices as well, but sharing those with my peers and letting them know based on my personal experience in education and my personal experience in elementary and high school, higher education, and what that means for myself and the implications it has for the career we're going into, which is super important and relates directly to my role here at PVCC and how the kind of overall goal of the education program is to provide students with perspectives, provide students with different ways of looking at the world around them through the lens of education. And I think that that's really helped me to highlight my Indigenous identity, not only through my personal education, but through my work that I do here at PVCC and my future work as well. So it's layered and multifaceted, and it's important for myself and others.
When you're going to school and you are in a classroom full of other people that don't know what growing up on the reservation or being Indigenous, growing up in that field or that identity, they have no idea. Like I was saying, my growing up with electricity, because I grew up at the beginning of my life, I was in Blanding, Utah, which is off the reservation among white people. That was where I started, but during the summers I'd always be dropped off at my grandparents' house, and having both sets of worlds, this is one world now going back to the reservation where there's no electricity, there's no indoor plumbing, there's no water ready available. Like you can't take an hour of shower when you have to bring the water in for yourself. There's no hot water, there's boiling and all that sort of stuff. And there's students out there who don't know or have never experienced this. So it's nice when you go into a classroom, just like you said, and you're doing the papers or you're writing about your experience and other people sharing that. It gives them a different perspective, a more rounded perspective on, not all my students are set in this little peg hole. Each one of my students have a different story. This one may have this one may have another one, and just not thinking of them all as just one bubble. And I think that's good, as we said, in an educational setting, and being an educator, to realize that. And in my field, being in financial aid, you do know that when Indians when natives are coming off onto the reservation, or even here in town with different groups of people, you have the empathy of saying, yes, I understand. You're not always everything's not always cut and dry. There's always multifaceted in life experience. Not everyone is well-to-do. Not everyone has both mom and dad in the family. They may have grown up with their aunt and uncle or their grandparents or whatever. And I think that when you go to school and you share your life or your experiences with other people, they get to see that and they get to learn more about that. And hopefully they take that into their, whatever they're going into, their walk of life. And when they see that, hopefully they'll remember, hey, I remember that. I better not put my lens and only see what I know on this particular person, and to give them the opportunity to learn and grow with that.
I think a huge part of higher learning is gaining those perspectives and looking at the world around you and looking at the different experiences people have and kind of developing that sense of culture and not only your own, but understanding others and looking at cultural diversity and what that looks like in different places. Because a lot of time when students, when faculty, when new staff come along, they are thrown into an environment that they're not necessarily familiar with. And so when you have the experiences that you do, especially in higher education, you're provided those experiences that help you later in your life, whether you're a student and you're preparing for a career, or if you're a faculty member or a staff member, to help you gain the experiences that you need to be successful in your role in the job you're doing and in your career. And you talked a lot about how we have our personal experiences and how we can't necessarily lump students into a certain kind of category or label. And I think that that's important because I think a lot of times, especially with institutions with high numbers of students, high population, students can kind of be seen as like just a number or part of bigger data. when that shouldn't necessarily be the case, because when we look at individual cases of students, we see the certain parts where we do have to have that compassion and that empathy, because we have to understand the student individually and understand their circumstances, their emotional well-being, their mental health, as well as their academic standing, their academic performance, because there's all different factors that play into whether and how a student is going to perform academically, taking into account their emotions as well as their culture. So like we talked about, both of us, it's layered and it's multifaceted, and there's a lot of things that go into consideration, especially in terms of Indigenous identity and how that impacts the education in our community, and not only for those in the community, but the greater world. I think it's important for students to understand that Indigenous and indigeneity doesn't only happen in the US. Yes, we have quote unquote Native Americans, but there are Native peoples throughout the world, and I think that it's important to kind of spread that awareness, because I think sometimes a lot, especially here in the US and here in Arizona, that again, that kind of gets lumped together as like, oh, you're Native American, you're kind of that experience again of that, maybe the Pilgrim and the Indian and the Thanksgiving story comes to mind, because a lot of times that's the only perspective students get through formal education. And when they get again to higher education, higher learning, they are put into this environment where they're learning these new things, and it may be difficult for them to learn because they don't have the experiences. And I think that that's where higher education has that really critical role in opening and broadening the mind of young people to prepare them for the world around them, because the world around them is diverse, it is different, and it can be welcoming. And I think that especially here at PVCC, we do a really great job at that. And I can speak from experience with the education program. A big part of what we're doing, a big push in our curriculum design, is to provide students with multiple perspectives from the courses that we offer. With cultural diversity in education, we talk a lot about students of exceptionality and disabilities, and looking at how we can meet the needs of students. And a lot of the time, at least from my personal experience, has been, how can I connect myself as an Indigenous person in the classes that I'm taking? How can I take my experiences, take it even further, and use that to the best of my ability and to my advantage to further myself in the career I'm going into? And I think that that's evident and applicable to any FOI. And it's powerful in itself to even know your identity and connect it to, well, what was the role my parents had? What were the role of my grandparents, my ancestors? And looking at where you stand individually in that timeline, that greater, bigger picture. At least for me, I feel like I stand out as, again, I'm a first generation college student, so that in itself is important to me. But I think looking again at the bigger picture, as an Indigenous person, as a Diné individual, holding a college degree is a big deal, especially when you have ancestors and grandparents who grew up without having electricity. My parents grew up without having electricity, without running water, and we see those things around us all the time, and it's a privilege to have those resources. Again, not everyone has access to those resources, and I think that, again, raising awareness about those things is important through our experience as Indigenous people. And that's
sharing it.
Exactly, sharing that information. We can't gatekeep the knowledge that we have, because if we are gatekeepers of that knowledge, there is no awareness, there is no education, there is no greater sense of welcoming someone into your community and sharing that knowledge with them, which I think is important, especially for students, because, again, college isn't like high school. High school, you're in a tight-knit community, and maybe you're in classes and going through high school with people you've known since you were in kindergarten. But once you get to college, you have to have a strong sense of your identity. And if you don't, it can be hard to navigate academics and your personal cultural self, and navigating that can be tricky, but when you have the support system like you have here at PVCC, I know that we offer counseling, academic advising, and even from faculty alone, I think that that does a lot in guiding students. And I'm sure a lot of that can be said with financial aid, especially when you're talking about the circumstances of certain students. And I know for myself, I was in the Hoop of Learning program here, and that afforded me a great opportunity to get ahead in my education, and I was able to graduate with my associate's degree in elementary education in 1 year due to being provided the opportunity from the Hoop of Learning program for Indigenous students. And again, I think that that goes down to access, the access that you have to those resources, because I know maybe not necessarily students in rural areas such as on the Navajo Nation don't have that access to the resource of getting ahead in their education and being in a dual enrollment program, in an early college program, which I think is a privilege in itself for me personally and in my experience.
So you wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, get on the bus at 7 to get to school at 8. You get out at 4 or 4, and you don't get home until 6 o'clock that night. So your evenings is, getting your work done before you have to go to bed, and your housework, all this stuff plus your homework, and then wake up tomorrow morning to get on the bus early in the morning again. So I think, just like you said, the access, the availability to get those things and to get ahead. Not everyone is afforded that. It's just where you live. Also, I think in school, you get to explain to people about yourself and about different things that they may have misconceptions. You hear that all the time in school when they start talking about this and that, and you have the opportunity to speak up and correct certain mistakes that they may have had. Like I remember someone telling me, "Oh, well, you don't have to worry about paying for anything." I'm like, what? No, I don't get free money for my education. I don't, Navajos, we have casinos finally, but that's not distributed to the people, so we don't get no casino money. It all goes back into the tribe, and they just divide it up and do for programs and trying to get other things done. So it's just not, you help correct some of those things. Not my mother-in-law, oh, thank goodness. But my sister-in-law, her mom, when they told them that she was getting married to a Native American guy, she goes, "Oh my God, I raised you all this far and got you your master's degree just for you to go live in a teepee." Some people out there have not had the exposure to living near Indigenous people and knowing what we live, how we live, and in this modern world. And we take that as an opportunity to educate them, and to tell them, no, we don't live in a teepee. This is our house, 2 stories, and we've taken her back onto the res to my mom's house, my dad's house, and they have electricity, they live in a community, and she got to learn firsthand that what her perception was incorrect. And I meet a lot of people like that who are in their own little world, in their own little community, and they just have not had the exposure outside of that to learn about Native Americans, because they haven't had the opportunity to learn. They've only hearsay in what they've seen in the newspaper or on TV. And so that's what I like about being in education and having the opportunity to talk to people. Yeah, not all people, as Indigenous, not all people are as open and forthcoming with their experience. Some of them will just let you talk and, well, I'm not going to talk to you again. But I find it's helpful and not confrontational, but just educate people on what really is going on, how we really live, and what's going out in the world. So I like education. I like educating people.